Welcome everybody to London Futurists. For those who don't know me, my name's David Wood and I'll shortly introduce today's speaker. Our topic today is the end of the world, or more accurately, thinking about the end of the world, or the history of thinking about the end of the world. How have ideas changed in past centuries and over recent decades concerning the possibility of human extinction? And how might ideas change in the near future concerning that possibility? And if we're more ambitious, we might discuss how do we want ideas to change in the near future concerning the possibility of human extinction. Our speaker today is Phil Torres, who is very well positioned to lead us through a discussion of these questions. Phil has spent many years focused on the nature and causes of human extinction and the ethical implications arising, as well as his publications in numerous scholarly journals and popular magazines such as Time, Slate, and Motherboard. He has written for the Future of Life Institute, and he has spent time as a research assistant for Ray Kurzweil. His background is in the philosophy of mind and the philosophy of science, and he has spent time at Harvard University and earned a master's degree in neuroscience from Brandeis University. In 2019, he was a visiting scholar at the Center of the Study of Existential Risks at the University of Cambridge. He is currently a PhD candidate at Leibniz University in Hanover, in Germany. Phil, welcome to London Futurists. Over to you.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. So I'm going to share some slides. As mentioned, this is a talk about thinking about the end of the world, the history of our understanding of the existential predicament of humanity on Earth and in the universe more generally. This is a topic that I've been focused on for the kind of in my spare time for the last few years. And finally was able to put together a book that is forthcoming, which I mostly wrote during this COVID pandemic, trying to take advantage of it being, locked indoors all day. So, okay, let's begin with a datum, which I think is going to be somewhat obvious to everybody in the audience here, which is that the notion of human extinction, the possibility of the human population dwindling to zero, is commonplace today. This notion is pervasive. You find it in the motivational rhetoric of Extinction Rebellion. There are books, lots of books being written about it. Activists, environmental activists holding up signs say we can't adapt to extinction and so on. So this, to further underline this point, if you look at a Google Ngram, the frequency of this collocation, this term, human extinction, has increased, quite significantly over time. And you could see, like 1980, there's a little blip, which we'll talk about in just a few moments. And actually, then the further back in history you go, even though you do find instances of human extinction in texts, dating from the 19th century, oftentimes this refers to the death of the individual, not the elimination or extermination of the entire species. So here's just zooming in a bit more. This is 1940 to 2019. And so it actually, even among children, this notion of human extinction is pretty widely is pretty easily grasped. So I asked some colleagues to query their children, if they felt comfortable doing so, about whether or not humanity could go extinct in the sense the dinosaurs did. So one answer that was conveyed to me was, oh yes, that could happen. A meteor could strike Earth, climate change could destroy all plant life, causing animals and humans to starve to death. And if we catch too many fish, there will be too much algae filling up the ocean, and without water, we die. So that was from Malcolm, a 7-year-old boy who was in Sweden. Not the mechanisms there of annihilation aren't extremely plausible, but nonetheless, he gets points for creativity. What I find really interesting about the fact that the notion of human extinction is so ubiquitous today, and even children do not have a problem answering the question, could humanity go extinct, is that throughout most of human history, the idea of human extinction would have appeared to be nonsensical. In a very real sense, the possibility of Homo sapiens disappearing from the universe would have been unthinkable. So to try to get a grasp of what I mean by this, you could analogize the question, can humanity go extinct, with the question, can married bachelors drive cars? So it's not that we lack studies on this, or we haven't made good observations whether or not married bachelors are driving cars. The question just doesn't make sense to begin with. So there are myriad reasons why it was the case that human extinction appeared to be nonsensical for many centuries throughout Western history. And I think the explanation can best be understood by looking at two main characters. One has to do with the secularization of Western culture, in particular Western intellectual culture, and the other had to do with the discovery and or creation of kill mechanisms. By kill mechanisms, I just mean some, well, actually, sorry, I will mention that in just a moment. It's basically some means by which the entire human population could disappear. So taking these in turns, let's begin with secularization. There are two questions we could ask here. Why did secularization happen? And then when did it actually happen? So let's begin with an important point that, let's begin with the important task of defining human extinction. So this actually has many normatively relevant terms that you find in the literature. The sense that is important for this talk is that, okay, there are no more members of Homo sapiens. This remains the case forever. It's irreversible, in other words, and we leave no successors. So it is, I think, very important to emphasize that this naturalistic scientific definition of human extinction is fundamentally different from the religious notion of apocalypse, the end of the world, the second coming, Armageddon, grand battle, and so on. Whereas religion, the end of the world within the eschatological systems of world religions, has to do with transformation. The scientific sense pertains to the termination of our evolutionary lineage. Okay, so question, why? Two basic reasons that insofar as one adopts a religious worldview, the secular scientific notion of human extinction will appear to be nonsensical. One is that we are understood to be ensouled bodies and embodied souls, where our souls have some kind of immortality, so they can survive physical death and so on. It follows that if it's the case that each of us is immortal, then the species itself is immortal. So this is an ontological point. The second is that extinction isn't how Holy Scripture is traditionally understood. As traditionally understood, says that the world will end. We're main characters in a pre-written cosmic drama that cannot unfold if we cease existing. Therefore, we can't cease existing. So hence, insofar as Western religious beliefs dominated thinking about the long-term future of humanity, human extinction would have appeared to be essentially oxymoronic or self-contradictory in exactly the same sense that married bachelor, or you could think of like circles with pointy corners, concepts like that appear to be oxymoronic or logically impossible. So moving on now to the when question. There are two periods of particular interest. One is 19th century, kind of the entire century. This is when you have notable irreligious intellectuals like William Godwin, Arthur Schopenhauer, Darwin, Marx, Nietzsche, and so on. And the reason that you see this pretty significant decline of religious belief during the 19th century comes down to three factors that historians widely recognize as catalyzing this retreat of religious authority. One just has to do with science, the theory of Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection in particular. Also, there were ethical challenges relating to the notion of that eternal punishment is a disproportionate, disproportionate given the crime of mere disbelief. This eventually yielded the problem of evil, and also then the rise of biblical criticism. So 19th century, significant decline, and then the next really important time period is the 1960s, which there's a scholar named Gavin Hyman who wrote a really good history of atheism, refers to this as the age of atheism, or at least when the age of atheism began. Gavin Hyman, in fact, argues that this is when, the 1960s is when Friedrich Nietzsche's famous and hackneyed declaration that God is dead and we've killed him really came to fruition. And the etiology of this, the cause, is multifaceted: Marxism, feminism, and so on and so on. So, and we could see all the way up to the present, this trend of secularization, at least in the West, persists. With some studies actually suggesting that religion will become extinct in the foreseeable future in 9 nations in the Western world. So this leads us to conclusion 1. It was the marginalization of religious belief, which began during the 19th century, further accelerated in the 1960s, that made the concept of human extinction increasingly intelligible. If there's no Heavenly Father watching over us, if we are fundamentally no different than other species, 99% of which died out, then it is at least logically possible for humanity to disappear, just like a whole bunch of other critters throughout history have. All right, so that is sort of the background enabling condition, as I've called it, for this story. The next character focuses on the triggering factors that that resulted in oftentimes pretty dramatic and abrupt shifts in our understanding of the general existential predicament. So here's a hypothesis. Even if you believe that human extinction is possible in principle, if there's no reason to think that it could in fact happen in our world, then there's going to be no particularly compelling occasion in which to entertain thoughts that include as a component the concept of human extinction. So this gets at sort of not the intelligibility of the concept, but the frequency of the concept. And a proxy measure of that would be Google Ngram or Google Trends or something like that. So here's the hypothesis continued. It was the discovery of legitimate ways that human extinction could go extinct, i.e. scientifically credible kill mechanisms, have caused more and more people over time to begin thinking seriously about this outcome. In other words, it was the discovery of these scientifically credible kill mechanisms that played a crucial role in thrusting the concept of human extinction, once intelligible, into the foreground of our thinking. So I periodized history, the history of thinking about this topic, into 5 periods with 4 distinct abrupt transitions between. And each of these periods is defined by the prevailing existential mood. An existential mood is just a fancy word for essentially this this notion that I've gestured at already several times, which is a broad, scientifically well-founded understanding of the general existential situation of humanity within the cosmos. It arises from how it is that we answer questions like, could human extinction happen in principle? That has to do with logical or metaphysical possibility. If so, could it actually happen in our world? That's a question about practical possibility. If so, how could it happen? How many kill mechanisms are there? Is the number growing or shrinking? Is it, how probable is our extinction? Is it natural or anthropogenic threats that are most worrisome, and so on? So to be clear, there were plenty of idiosyncratic speculations about how humanity could perish throughout history. Montesquieu, talks about population decline, worries that, or at least he has one of his characters in 1721 Persian letters, worry that population decline will ultimately lead to extinction of humanity. Comte de Buffon, who was a hugely influential scientist, he had this theory of Earth's origin, according to which there was a collision with the sun, and Earth was essentially a piece of the sun that broke off from it, and consequently it's been cooling over time. So projecting then into the future, eventually Earth will become uninhabitable due to refrigeration, as he put it. Mary Shelley talked about worldwide plagues, and so on and so on. But the thing is that none of these were widely accepted by the scientific or the community of natural philosophers at the time, they really were intriguing, but merely idiosyncratic speculations, as mentioned. So really, the first credible mechanism that could have that will ultimately result in the disappearance of humanity came from the discovery of the second law of thermodynamics, and that was in the very early 1850s by Rudolf Clausius and Lord Kelvin, aka William Thomson. And so basically, the second law says, that entropy will, spontaneously tends towards maximum in isolated systems, i.e., systems that are unable to exchange matter energy with their surrounding environment. As Henry Adams said, whose father and grandfather were U.S. presidents, he was very well known for being a pessimistic guy. He described it as the ash heap becomes ever bigger. So there are eschatological implications of this that were immediately recognized by physicists at the time. Earth, if not the entire universe, this was an idea that was later put forward called the heat death by Helmholtz. Earth, if not the entire cosmic abode, will become increasingly inhospitable to life until biological life is no longer possible. Hence, the Austrian physicist Joseph Loschmidt described the second law in 1876 as a terroristic nimbus, which lets it appear as a destructive principle of all life in the universe. And what was different about this idea was that it was based on a considerable amount of very compelling evidence that essentially was accumulated by engineers in decades leading up to the 1850s. So to understand the shift that this, in existential mood, that this triggered, we have to understand what the previous existential mood was. The essence of the previous existential mood, going back all the way to ancient Greece, was the notion that humanity is indestructible, or at the very least, the value that humanity is associated with is indestructible. So Aristotle, for example, believed that species are not only immutable, but eternal. The great chain of being emerged from this idea called the principle of plenitude that has been traced all the way back to Plato. And this essentially said that the great chain of being is which you could see on the left of the screen, an illustration of it. This is a representation, it is an indication of God's perfection. And if there was a single chain missing in this great chain of beings, from lowly creatures all the way to humans at the top, angels and God beyond that, then the entire chain would collapse, and that would imply God's imperfection. Therefore, it's impossible for any species to disappear. So I think in my sort of combing through the oceanic literature that's relevant to this topic from the prior to the 19th century, I feel like the best succinct expression of this early existential mood came from Benjamin Franklin's Poor Man's Almanac. He's talking about the possibility of comet strike, and he says, "But our comfort is the same great power that made the universe governs it by his providence, and such terrible catastrophes will not happen, 'tis best they should." And so I think that word comfort is really important. So even if there's a catastrophe in the future, in the end, everything will be okay, because there is a loving God who's looking out for us, and he will, again, ultimately, our future is in paradise with him forever. So after the second law, you get this really significant shift, particularly, unsurprisingly, among people who have atheistic tendencies like Bertrand Russell. So in the end, all will be lost, so says the fundamental laws of physics. The result was a kind of cosmic nihilism, doubts about the ultimate meaningfulness of human existence in the universe. So 1903, in an article called Free Man's Worship, Bertrand Russell famously said, "The second law implies that all the labors of the ages, all the devotion, all the inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius are destined to extinction in the vast death of the solar system, and that the whole temple of man's achievement must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of a universe in ruins." So this is pretty pervasive at the time, I should say. You find lots and lots of people bemoaning the inevitable extinguishing of human life in the distant future. And I think it was this mood that more or less prevailed for an entire century until the second half of the 1950s. There were, I would like to note, there were growing anxieties, especially after World War I, about the possibility of human self-annihilation. So the possibility of anthropogenic extinction rather than natural extinction. So Winston Churchill had this 1924 paper called "Shall We Commit Suicide?" where he fears our causing our own extermination. JBS Haldane had similar concerns. Sigmund Freud closed Civilization and Its Discontents in 1930 with the assertion that men have brought their powers of subduing the forces of nature to such a pitch that by using them, they could now very easily exterminate one another to the last man. But a lot of this was really just hyperbolic. There's a lot of exaggeration for rhetorical purposes. I don't believe anybody really thought that another world war with machine guns and even weapons of mass destruction like chemical weapons and so on would actually kill every last person on the planet. More to say about that, but not for this talk. So then I feel like the critical event in terms of introducing a new existential mood was the Castle Bravo debacle. So this happened in 1954, and it was a thermonuclear test. Thermonuclear weapons were invented 2 years before, 1952, and there's a thermonuclear test in the Marshall Islands that ended up producing an explosive yield 2.5 times greater than what was calculated by the physicists. And as a result, there was an international incident involving some Japanese sailors, fishermen, and also it was the case there were detectable amounts of radioactive particles that diffused around the entire globe. So for the first time, there was a very widespread, there was a sense among reputable scientists that even a smaller scale thermonuclear weapon could actually make Earth's surface uninhabitable to human life by as a result of global radioactive fallout. So in the Russell-Einstein Manifesto, which was written by Bertrand Russell in 1954, and signed by Einstein just before his death, specifically referred to the Castle Bravo debacle in declaring that a war with H-bombs might possibly put an end to the human race. If many H-bombs are used, there will be universal death, which is an amazing term that Russell used a lot, sudden only for a minority, but for the majority, a slow torture of disease and disintegration. They add that those who know most are the most gloomy. So it was as a result of this that suddenly it became clear that human extinction was something that could happen on timescales relevant to people living, in the second half of the 20th century. The situation was, so following the Castle Bravo debacle, there was kind of this small explosion of additional anthropogenic concerns having to do with pollution. So, Rachel Carson's book more or less initiated the modern environmentalist movement by calling attention to environmental pollutants, synthetic insecticides and so on. There were kind of early concerns from like I.J. Good and a few others about the possibility of an intelligence explosion involving artificial intelligent machines that could ultimately lead to either a utopia or human extinction. First warnings of climate change were made to the US government during the Johnson administration, 1965. Paul Ehrlich, the Club of Rome, sounded the alarm about overpopulation, overconsumption. In the early 1980s, there was the nuclear winter hypothesis, which was was popularized in an article co-authored by Carl Sagan. And this introduced really the second scientifically robust nuclear-related kill mechanism, and once again was kind of a game changer. And then worries about nanotechnology also emerged kind of in the mid-80s. So as a result of this, the hallmarks of this new existential mood were intense feelings of impending doom. Self-annihilation could happen not millions or tens of millions of years in the future as a result of the entropic dilapidation of the universe, but it could actually happen tomorrow. And you get there are so many examples of leading scientists, journalists, philosophers, and so on, who expressed this new mood. John Platt talks about, how might be a 50-50 chance of something destroying the human race forever within 10 or 20 years. There was a survey shortly after the Cuban Missile Crisis that found 40% of adolescents experienced a great deal of anxiety associated with the possibility of nuclear war. And so on. I mean, there's the evidence here is quite copious. Really a significant cultural shift in thinking about our precarity moving forward. I'll skip over these quotes because I think we're running a little bit low on time. So there are two more shifts. The fourth one happened in the 1980s, and even though it's in terms of chronological history overlaps with the previous existential mood, it thematically is quite different, because this focused on the question of whether there are natural threats that also pose extinctional hazards in the near term. And so really starting from the 1830s with a guy named Charles Lyell, there was a paradigm within the earth sciences called Uniformitarianism, according to which all changes in the physical world occur slowly, gradually. So an implication of that is that mass extinctions as a result of global scale catastrophes do not occur. The notion, for example, that an asteroid could strike Earth or a comet, or that there could be a supervolcano eruption or something, these were almost unanimously rejected by the scientific community at the time. And this really changed beginning in 1980 with the Alvarez hypothesis, which basically put forward the idea that the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs 65 or 66 million years ago, that was the result of a massive asteroid that struck Earth and lofted all sorts of dust into the stratosphere, which is above the weather. So then the dust circulates around the Earth, it blocks out incoming solar radiation. The food chains die as a result of diminished photosynthesis and so on. So this is how this is the reason that the dinosaurs disappeared. And initially, there was a lot of skepticism. One of the main reasons for skepticism is people said, if it was the case that this massive asteroid struck Earth, where is the crater? There ought to be evidence somewhere of this, extraordinarily powerful, devastating event happening. And so for 10 years, there was no crater identified that's had the right timing, dated back 66 million years ago, and was the right size. That changed with the rediscovery of the Chicxulub crater in the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico in 1990. And very quickly after that, the entire scientific community, more or less, came to concur that yes, in fact, there was this global scale catastrophe that wiped out the non-avian dinosaurs 66 million years ago. And it was right around this time that also the volcanologists for the very first time were identifying these huge, massive volcanoes that would be able to expel enough sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere to bring about a volcanic winter, which is very much analogous in terms of the mechanism of action as an impact winter. So it was really the early 1990s. Actually, there's a book by Walter Alvarez, who was one of the co-authors of the Alvarez hypothesis paper called T-Rex and the Crater of Doom, where he says it was really, I think, the winter between 1991 and 1992, that was the turning point. And that was when the scientific community finally said, okay, yes, actually uniformitarianism is dead. we need to embrace this kind of neo-catastrophism view, according to which nowhere is safe for humanity. The universe is put a bit floridly. The universe is a veritable torture chamber cluttered with death traps above and below, heavens and the earth. So this was the fourth major shift in existential mood. The fifth shift then, I think, happens in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And there are three main factors. So unlike the previous shifts, this one didn't arise. It wasn't triggered by the discovery of one or more new kill mechanisms. Rather, it was just this kind of confluence of different considerations, some of which were philosophical in nature, such as the rise of anthropic reasoning, which I won't discuss here, although the doomsday argument is very fun to chat about. But of course, the environmental crisis was getting worse, and we know today that it's a really, really, really bad situation. But there was also, I think, key to this most recent shift in existential mood was a futurological pivot toward thinking seriously about 21st century emerging threats associated with emerging technologies, in addition to the older 20th century existing threats, such as nuclear proliferation and pollution and things of that nature. So the emerging technologies of note here are like biotechnology, synthetic biology, molecular nanotechnology, which doesn't exist today, but is anticipated to be invented at some point in the next several decades. And then, of course, artificial intelligence. A newer concern is the possibility of planetary scale geoengineering. So the associated threats then are like designer pathogens, engineered pandemics, nanoterrorism, nano arms race, and then also artificial intelligence, artificial general intelligence, and perhaps most worrisomely, artificial superintelligence. So, and there are three properties that people around the turn of the 21st century identified explicitly as being the source of immense danger, immense unprecedented and qualitatively new danger moving into the new century. One is that a lot of these technologies are dual use in nature. So the very same artifact or bit of information or theory or whatever that can be used for beneficial ends can be used also for harmful ends. So for example, very same centrifuges that could be used to enrich uranium for nuclear power plants could also be used to enrich uranium for nuclear weapons. And there's no way really to disentangle those good and bad uses. They're also becoming exponentially more powerful. The classic instance of this is Moore's law, but there are plenty of others. Carlson curve having to do with biotechnology. A lot of these are sort of subsumed under what Ray Kurzweil calls the law of accelerating returns. And the third property is that they're becoming more and more accessible to small groups and even individuals. And when you combine these three properties, you get a worrisome situation where there is if not already right now, in the near future, there will be a rapid multiplication of the total number of actors, both state and non-state being the most important, who are capable of unilaterally destroying the world. This is a topic that I discuss under the umbrella of agential risk. And this is super worrisome because probabilities very quickly add up over space and time, as John Sotos discusses in a very insightful article from, I think, 2018 called Biotechnology of Lifetime Technical Civilizations. So what was the new existential mood? There was a conviction that however hazardous the previous century may have been, the next century will be far more hazardous. Ray Kurzweil expresses this. Nick Bostrom gives us a 20% chance of surviving the current century. Lord Martin Rees famously said that there's a 50% chance of civilization collapsing before the 22nd century. Stephen Hawking said in 2016, shortly before he passed away, that we're at the most dangerous moment of human history. Chomsky said this, Max Tegmark, there are many, many other notable figures. All of this is consistent with the fact that the doomsday clock, which is run by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist, is set to 100 seconds before midnight, which is the closest to midnight, representing doom, that has ever been in its history since 1947, when it was invented. But I think Bill Joy, in 2000, he captured the essence of this new mood better than anyone else in an article that went viral and initiated a really vigorous public debate about the pro-technology, technophilic views and then neo-Ludditic views. And he wrote in this article, I think it is no exaggeration to say we're on the cusp of the further perfection of extreme evil, an evil whose possibility spreads well beyond that which weapons of mass destruction bequeathed to the nation states onto a surprising and terrible empowerment of extreme individuals. So this is essentially where we are now. And I'll end here. I had one more slide, which we could talk about later. But for the book, this is a little animated, a little illustrated timeline of these 5 different existential moods. So thank you very much for listening.
So Phil, that was really so interesting. I do want to give you a couple more minutes to draw out what was in that slide that you jumped over. So by all means, complete the story.
Okay, great. Yeah. So there's no reason to believe that this sort of meta-narrative having to do with these existential, the transitions between the existential moods is over. Insofar as I'm right that the 2 main characters are secularization, which has to do with the intelligibility of the concept of human extinction, and then the recognition of various kill mechanisms, which have to do with the practical possibility of human extinction occurring in our actual world. Then this you could one way to look at this is as not just an explanatory hypothesis, but also as a predictive hypothesis. So hence, if it's the case that the secularization trend reverses in the future, you might expect the notion of human extinction to once again acquire that connotation of incoherence. Once again, people may come to believe that since we have immortal souls, and since we're the main characters in this eschatological narrative that is pre-written in the prophetic verses of Holy Scripture, then we simply can't disappear. It could also be the case that we reinterpret different kill mechanisms through the prism of religious eschatology. So, for example, throughout history, 20th century history, the identification of different kill mechanisms associated with, for example, nuclear conflict, there were plenty of religious individuals at the time who actually saw the invention of nuclear weapons as a fulfillment of Scripture. In other words, there is this new technology that initially seemed to be an anomaly in terms of the end time story that they subscribed to, but then it was actually sort of quickly integrated into that story. So like famously, Ronald Reagan in 1971, I think when he was governor of California, he was at a dinner and is recorded saying that everything is falling into place, thanks to nuclear weapons now, the prophecies of Ezekiel. And if I remember correctly, the prophecy has to do with melting flesh. That's part of the prophecy. He says, now because of nuclear weapons, we actually can imagine how this prophecy relating to the melting flesh could actually come about. So, and that's just one example. There were plenty of evangelicals at the time who found that the introduction of nuclear weapons really was just confirmed their religious beliefs. It reinforced their confidence in the end times narrative of Book of Revelation and Daniel and whatever. So I don't mean to be long-winded about that, but all of that is to say that, for example, if religion were to become to once again become more and more dominant in our thinking about the long-term future of humanity, then the existential mood could change once again, such that perhaps we come to, collectively sort of come to reject the notion that we are actually existentially vulnerable or precarious in the universe. Even if and as it happens, the religion's on the rise globally. So, there's Alan Cooperman, who's, I think, the director of religion, the department at the Pew Research Center. He has this nice little memorable phrase. He says, you could think about it as the secularizing West and the rapidly growing West. So statistically, the people who do not subscribe to any particular religious ideology, that is decreasing. I think from like 16% to 13% from a few years ago to the middle of this century. So that may be worrisome insofar as you believe that it's important that it's necessary in order to protect to ensure our continued survival. It is at least necessary to recognize that it's possible. So you might worry that if a growing number of people come to believe that human extinction is impossible, that might actually make us more vulnerable to catastrophe than we otherwise would be. But even if the secularization trend continues or stabilizes rather than reverses, it's still, of course, possible that we could discover all sorts of kill mechanisms in the future. Perhaps there are natural kill mechanisms that we haven't identified. After all, it is a mind-boggling fact that before 1980, going back to, as I mentioned, like 1830, at least, scientists almost unanimously rejected the possibility of global scale natural catastrophes. So nobody knew about super volcanic eruptions throughout most of the Cold War. Nobody was worried about a large asteroid slamming into Earth and destroying Homo sapiens. So it's not difficult to extrapolate this into the future and imagine us discovering natural threats of which we are as ignorant today as Earth scientists were of supervolcanoes back in 1920 or whatever. So yeah, in fact, when I was writing about this particular issue, the scientists announced the discovery of a brand new type of sort of natural disaster type phenomenon, which they called storm quakes, which have to do with something like when there are violent storms above the ocean, there could be mechanical forces that pass through the water and actually induce earthquakes on the ocean floor. So anyways, that's not a threat to humanity, but that just underlined to me while I was writing about this issue that there's really a lot that we don't know about the universe. Then on the other side, obviously, the enterprise of scientific and technological development continues at an exponential pace, and we have there are some technologies that we anticipate, I think, in a justified, for good reason, like nanotechnology and AI, or artificial general intelligence. But who knows how many technologies there are that are hidden just behind the horizon of our collective imaginations. So it's entirely possible that, as I've mentioned before, a book that catalogs all of the existential threats to humanity today might be just 10% of a book written about the same topic in 100 years as a result of technology and scientific progress and so on. So the story's not over. And there are these two factors, these two characters that are interacting in complicated ways. And yes, and it will be very interesting to see how this story continues to unfold in the future.
Many thanks, Phil. Well, we're going to discuss how this story might unfold in the future. Thanks to everybody who's already submitted interesting questions. There are 7 so far in the Q&A window. I encourage audience members to take a look and either vote up some of the questions there, so we'll take them sooner than the others, or you can add your own question into the window. But to start off with, let me ask you, Phil,
Mhm.
you've mentioned both Ray Kurzweil and Bill Joy as people who made influential comments about the role of technology. Are you more sympathetic to Ray Kurzweil when he says that technology is going to enhance us and save us from whatever existential risks there are? Or are you more sympathetic personally to Bill Joy, who said, whoa, let's not do this because we don't know where it's heading and it's likely to be bad?
Yeah, well, it's worth mentioning I didn't read this quote from earlier, but Kurzweil said, I think this was in The Singularity is Near. People should double check that, but I think it was the case. My own view is that a planet approaching its pivotal century of computational growth as the Earth is today has a better than even chance of making through. But then I've always been accused of being an optimist. So, Kurzweil does have a reputation, obviously, of being techno-optimistic. But nonetheless, I feel like he acknowledges that in addition to the promise, that the peril is really, really significant and deeply worrisome. So, in other words, I'm trying to suggest that Bill Joy and Ray Kurzweil are, in a sense, more aligned than one might initially think. But clearly, Bill Joy was, he did advocate for the broad relinquishment of entire domains of ostensibly risky technologies. And I myself began 20 years ago most sympathetic with anarcho-primitivism, this notion that we should sort of return to nature and reintegrate ourselves, and we should not have these, we should abolish the mega technics that are, driving, climate change, and perhaps, like alienation and, things of that sort. And then it became clear, I read about the autonomous technology thesis. Langdon Winner was a technology critic who wrote about this very competently. And I found the idea to be quite cogent. And it's essentially the idea that that the development of technology, in a sense, has a life of its own, that it depends upon the actions of individuals, but ultimately there is no individual or no actor, whether at a state level or in terms of a corporation or an individual, who is in control. So analogously, you can imagine like the direction and the movement of a murmuration of starlings. And it depends on the individual choices of all the starlings, but ultimately nobody's in charge of that. So then I thought, well, maybe the best thing to do would be, because bringing the juggernaut of technologization to a halt may be completely infeasible. Maybe the best thing to do is to figure out how to direct the trajectory in ways that are most optimal. And so then I found myself very much in line with transhumanists. And I was excited by a lot of Kurzweil's ideas and the singularitarian worldview in general. And then I feel like over just the past several years, the pendulum swung back in the other direction a bit, and I've become much more skeptical about, for example, the societal implications of life extension technology or other forms of radical human enhancement. I do worry greatly that they will exacerbate inequality. A concern that Yuval Noah Harari has expressed in Homo Deus, I think in a pretty compelling way. And that perhaps the fact that these technologies we need to enhance ourselves, and hence to frankly to ameliorate the human condition, which does, which is marked by all sorts of terrible disease and aging and so on. That the fact that they're dual use and therefore will bring these introduce these risks at the same time that they introduce these benefits. That perhaps the risks are so formidable that it might not be worth it in the end, or at least that we should take a step back and seriously think about the wisdom of moving ahead with the development of these technologies, because there is even among the pro-technology, the technocratic type crowd, there is widespread agreement that the probability of human extinction is something like 20% this century. Whereas, prior to the first anthropogenic threats, when all we had to worry about was entropy and asteroids and stuff like that, the probability was probably like 1 out of 10,000 per century. So it's just this massive increase in the probability. And I suspect that nobody would get on a plane knowing that there's a 20% chance of the plane crashing. But that is the predicament of humanity as a whole right now this century, if you take seriously these claims from Nick Bostrom and Chomsky and Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists and so on. So I have very mixed feelings. I have nothing against tech. I'm certainly not a Luddite by any means, but I do worry that in the messy real world, the introduction of these technologies could have unintended consequences that are really terrible. So I'm anxious. That's it.
Well, let's look at some possible solutions. You've looked at history. Cornelius Holtorf asks if you have looked at different cultures from around the world and their attitudes towards existential risks. His question is, are there human cultures outside the Western tradition and the global North for whom human extinction is intelligible and imaginable in the way that you said wasn't historically for most of the global North? And could we learn from any such thinking about the end of the world?
Yeah, I think that is a really, really good question. My focus really in terms of writing the book and researching, conducting research over the past several years, it has been it's been a bit Eurocentric. And I think that is ultimately a flaw of the approach. And my only excuse is that time and cognitive resources are finite. But I think you're exactly right. I mean, there was actually a quite good book that I read a couple months ago called Sand Talk, where there's a Aboriginal Australian who's looking at global risk from this sort of traditional indigenous perspective. And there was, I think, quite a bit of insight to glean from that. So my familiarity with non-Western cultures is time specific. So the further back in time you go, the more familiar I am, like ancient Egyptian mythology or the Aztec mythological system and so on. But more contemporary non-Western cultures, I'm not all that familiar with. And that would be the next step in a comprehensive look at this topic. So I think it's a superb question. Yeah.
Any one book has got to focus, otherwise we never finish. Are you aware of people in China or in Russia who are seriously thinking about these things? When after all, there's lots of technology that's being developed at a great pace in China and in parts of Russia as well.
Yeah, definitely. The notion of existential risk. I don't know how familiar a lot of viewers would be with it, but so just real briefly, it was formalized in 2002 by Nick Bostrom, who's at Oxford University, University's Future of Humanity Institute, and as a result, Bostrom's main contribution was essentially establishing kind of a research program that has yielded a sizable community of philosophers, scientists, political theorists, and so on, based around Oxford, around Cambridge, and so on, who are thinking seriously about the long-term future of humanity and the ways that our potential in the cosmos could be permanently and drastically compromised. And so the reason I mention that is this field is very well funded. It's affiliated with these prestigious institutions, and as a result, the notion of existential risk, I feel like, has caught on in various parts of the world. I know of people in Russia who who conduct research focused on understanding the nature of existential risk and strategies for mitigating existential risk and so on. That's also the case in China, although I'm less familiar with the communities there who are interested in the topic. But definitely there is I think a growing awareness around the world of the fact that we are in a kind of qualitatively new era of extremely historically anomalously high levels of danger to our survival on the planet.
Let's take a question about another topic you raised, religion. Wojtek Budzinski asks for more evidence that religion is on the rise globally. He said he thought that secularization and atheism are growing and quite dynamically. What's your evidence otherwise?
Mostly, I am relying on this. I think it was a 2015 study by Pew, and they, I think the methodology seemed, quite robust, and so I found their conclusions at least worth taking seriously. And the conclusions were that globally, mostly as a result of like differential kind of birth rates, paired with the fact that people tend to inherit the religion from their parents, that globally religion is on the rise, even though within the West, in the US, in Europe, and so on, the decline of a religious belief is it continues apace, quite rapidly. So as I mentioned, Alan Cooperman said, it's about the secularizing West and the rapidly growing West. But I agree that there are the study that I mentioned from Pew could definitely be controverted. So I agree. I don't know for sure, but it seems not unreasonable to suspect that actually this is the way the demographics will change in the future.
Well, after all, the current American president does go to church quite often as a Catholic. Yeah. Mike Pompeo, who was Secretary of State under the last American regime, he is on record of speaking to some audiences quite enthusiastically about the possibility of an apocalyptic war. And it's hard to know when these people are just playing to the galleries and don't actually believe what they're saying and when they are swept along by it. I guess we needn't worry that there will be a majority of people pursuing potentially dangerous brands of religion, but it only needs to be a small number, as you've said, and whether they are running Iran or Israel or a secular version, North Korea, that could be extremely worrying.
Absolutely. Also, maybe worth noting, there's a historian named Paul Boyer who passed away not that long ago. And he has done some really fascinating work on the influence of religious apocalyptic beliefs on American political culture. And so he's actually argued that you really can't understand American foreign policy even without an understanding of specifically a dispensationalist interpretation of the Christian end times. And so point is, there's some suggestion that the Iraq War may have been influenced by some of these apocalyptic beliefs. And even like the Balfour Declaration might have been influenced. That goes way back and has influenced Middle Eastern politics for a long time. Anyways, point is that yes, maybe you don't need actually even a sizable portion of the American populace, which scholars have actually called the Armageddon lobby. And you really only need a few people in power. And certainly throughout history, there have been these individuals. Even more recently, the 2016 election, I compiled a list of quotes from Ben Carson, who said that we might be in the end times. Ted Cruz's father has described him as playing an integral role in what he referred to as the end times transfer of wealth, as part of this dominionist view of the American project. Whereby religious individuals get lots of political power just before the end times.
One of the questions that has the most votes now is, can we be a little bit more precise in the talking about the probabilities of some of these risks. It's a question by Antonio Urquiza. Are there probabilistic models that predict the likelihood of the different natural sources of destruction, or I guess any of the other sources? Otherwise, we're just talking, and the beginning of science is when you can start to measure things.
Yeah, it's a superb question. So obviously, with respect to asteroids and volcanic eruptions and so on, there is a verifiable empirical history that from which you can derive probability estimates. So those tend to be, I think, like fairly robust. Like supervolcanic eruptions occur on average every 50,000 years. I think every I don't know, millions and millions of years there's 12K asteroid with a 12 kilometer diameter that crashes into Earth. So beyond that, though, there is a lot of educated, well, people in the field would describe it as educated conjecture, and it's really based on like technological forecasting and just kind of best guesses. So you're exactly right. I guess what's notable about a lot of these estimates is they do tend to congregate around, these are overall estimates of the probability of human extinction this century. They do tend to congregate around 20%, even among people with quite different views of what the main threats are, and so on. So there's an interesting convergence there, which suggests, perhaps only weakly, that figure should be taken seriously. But ultimately, these are subjective estimates.
But it's not just the estimate of how likely it is that there will be some existential disaster, but can we pin down which of them are more credible, more serious than the others? Because different apparent experts seem to have very different views as to how likely it is that artificial general intelligence will prove to be destructive, or climate change needs to be taken seriously, and so on. Can we do better than just the gut feelings?
Yes. Well, I mean, even with climate change, there's still, there was a paper published just, I think last year, that attempted to work out how exactly it is that climate change, severe climate change, could bring about the collapse of human civilization, because nobody had really kind of worked that out before. I mean, there were hints and gestures, in the direction of the actual, mechanism of the world, but there is a lot of guesswork, and so here's to make this a bit more concrete. I suspect that something like a natural pandemic is unlikely to eliminate every human on the planet. The argument behind that is that there tends to be a natural inverse relationship between transmissibility of germs and lethality of germs. Because if the germ is just going to kill the host immediately, that is going to greatly decrease the probability that it's able to leap to another host. So that'll be evolutionary dead end. So you don't want to be too lethal, in order to be transmissible and so on. So I think based on this argument, it seems unlikely that there would be a natural pandemic that actually wipes out humanity. In contrast, when you've got CRISPR-Cas9, for example, and other synthetic biology techniques, then you can break down that inverse relationship and perhaps create a bug that combines high transmissibility and high lethality in a unnatural way. So that suggests that an engineered pandemic is going to be much more probable than a natural pandemic. And so then, similarly, looking at the arguments for like the risks associated with machine superintelligence, there seems to be a very good case based on just sort of based on this sort of armchair line of reasoning that if you have a system that has superhuman capacity for problem solving, then if the motivational value system that is loaded into that machine is slightly misaligned with our values, whatever that means exactly, that this could indeed have really catastrophic consequences. and hence there seems to be, there's more to say about that, of course, but in brief, and hence that I.J. Good's 1965 suggestion that the outcome of superintelligence will be binary, either utopia, it'll solve all our problems, whatever, or it'll be completely annihilatory and devastating to humanity. These arguments give credence to that conclusion, and consequently, me along with others in the community have come to the tentative but somewhat sort of confident conclusion that artificial superintelligence could be potentially the greatest threat that we face this century, because it seems very likely that we will actually create superhuman AI, and that again the outcome will be binary. So I hope maybe this helps a little bit, but I feel like the pushback that the individual asking the question is suggesting is, I think, totally warranted. And this is, the study of these issues is very much incipient, and there are a lot of people desperately feeling around in the dark right now for a light switch. So I think it's perfectly legitimate to question some of these estimates. Yep.
We're talking about the risks from artificial superintelligence. Terry Raby has an interesting angle on that. Maybe it'd be a good thing if artificial superintelligence came along and pushed humanity aside, making humanity survival itself indifferent. Then it'd be a more powerful, more robust entity, and humanity would have fulfilled its purpose, even if we were extinct. Do you have any sympathy for that kind of analysis?
Well, I mean, that's one view. That's a view that someone could have about what our purpose is. To pass the baton to some artificial intelligence of some sort. Obviously, lots of people would disagree with that view. There definitely are moral perspectives. I mean, if you're a utilitarian, for example, and what matters is the maximization of intrinsic value. So that could be like pleasure or something. That's the classic hedonist interpretation of utilitarianism. So if that's your moral view, and if you believe that a superintelligence would be able to realize more pleasure than humanity, then you would be perhaps be sympathetic to this view that we should pass the baton onto the superintelligence. Others would object and say, no, that's the classic utility monster objection to utilitarianism. But yeah, I don't know. It's exactly these sorts of, you could call them like normative futurologies, normative accounts about what ought to be the case in the future that also really haven't been thoroughly explored. Because the fact is that, consider a bioconservative, for example, Francis Fukuyama, or a bunch of others who believe that radical human enhancement would be a travesty, and we should do everything and therefore transhumanism is the most dangerous ideology in the world. Their argument is that there's some like special property of humans, factor X or something, and if we lose it, it'll undermine liberal democracy. But the fact is that if you take evolutionary biology seriously, and you should, every species that doesn't end in extinction is a transitory, is a transitional phase between the extinct and the not yet extant. So, in other words, I'm trying to say that we are going to change in the future. We are going to be post-humans at some point, if only because of Darwinian or just evolutionary mechanisms. So we have to, at some point, think seriously about what it is we want. Do we want to blindly evolve into the future? Do we want to try to take control of evolution ourselves? I am extremely anxious about the latter, but then again, like the former might not be any better. So maybe then we should use genetic engineering technologies to intentionally modify our phenotypes moving forward. So yeah, I find myself not so excited about the thought of being replaced by machines in the future, but I think that this space of possibility needs to be understood and articulated better, because I don't really have a good argument for one position over another. So, yeah.
I mean, my own view on that is that there are two drawbacks about such a scenario. One is that the ASI may lack consciousness, so the universe might end up having more intelligence in it, but no inner life. And we don't know that. Even more worrying is that if the artificial superintelligence is misconfigured in some way that it destroys us, it may also destroy the preconditions for its own continuing existence. So it might push us aside briefly before it itself succumbs. So I think I'm with you, Phil. We need to have a clearer understanding of where all this might head to.
Yeah. So I mentioned early on that when I defined the term human extinction, that there are, if you sort of peruse the scholarly literature on the ethical and evaluative implications of human extinction, you find a whole bunch of very distinct notions of what human extinction could be. So what you're gesturing at, David, is the possibility that there could be intelligent creatures, machines in the future that lack consciousness. I take it that this would be a form of like what we could call normative extinction, where we do have successors, but the successors lack some property having to do with the phenomenology of experience, having to do with the capacity to realize intrinsic value like pleasure or well-being, such that we would not consider it to be an existential win. Even though, and it doesn't just have to be like machines that we, just program directly and kind of don't have any spatio-temporal continuity with us. It could also be just through, human radical enhancement. It could be the case that, by modifying our brains in certain ways, ultimately our progeny, many generations from now, lack that capacity for the inner life that is the locus of what we take to be value in the universe, conscious experience. And so even though there's spatial temporal continuity, we've survived in a significant, physical sense, but nonetheless, we've gone normatively extinct because, that's not an outcome that any of us would consider to be, like I said, an existential win.
Good time for a few more questions. Again, I ask the audience, if you wish to ensure that one of the questions has a higher chance of being asked, then please cast a vote for it. I'm going to take one which is near the top of the pile by Steve Buss, who asks, if you're detecting a change of mood, you mentioned that some people are saying they were previously not so keen about technology, but now they're saying, well, maybe technology must be leveraged to save us. And he references a writer on climate change, Elizabeth Kolbert, whose most recent book is this Under a White Sky. And she's all but says there will be a probable need for solar geoengineering to reduce climate change. So is that an isolated example, or are you seeing a bigger trend towards people saying, let's use more technology, or are there countervailing trends as well?
Really good question. I feel like in terms of like solar geoengineering, there definitely is this growing concern among scientists that, we're not going to meet the IPCC's 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial level limit in terms of the ambient CO2 concentrations. And so we might actually need to begin researching right now these sort of extreme technological interventions. And it is, my sense, I haven't read Colbert's book, but I did see her give a talk recently on it. And my sense was that she's not, people would need to correct me, I could be wrong about this, but my sense she's not particularly excited about this possibility. I've also exchanged emails with a bunch of scientists who are on the vanguard of this research. And a lot of them, despite the fact that they're even contributing in some way to the furtherance of stratospheric geoengineering technologies, are nonetheless pretty terrified of what the implementation of a regime of solar geoengineering would look like in the messy real world. So my sense also is that even among people who are working specifically on existential risk, there is definitely a lot of people are cognizant of the fact that there is a long history of techno fixes that have in the end exacerbated the situation. So like there was the Green Revolution. I mentioned Paul Ehrlich and the Club of Rome, and they had these neo-Malthusian warnings. Paul Ehrlich said, millions of people in the 1970s and 80s would die as a result of starvation. And then you had the Green Revolution, which sort of started before that, but really unfolded during that period of time, and averted some of these really awful potential outcomes. That's good, but at the same time, like the effects of the Green Revolution, I think probably one could make an argument that they've made things a lot worse. There are massive dead zones, hypoxic regions of the ocean that are the size of states, U.S. states, where basically nothing but algae can survive, and so on and so on. So I think there is this sense that we ought to be just really circumspect moving forward. I mean, the introduction of automobiles is another fantastic example. Really, the early 1900s. That was described literally as a panacea for urban pollution, because at the time there were all these horse-drawn carts, and there were horse carcasses that were rotting in the street, and all sorts of manure, and hilarious estimates like in the New York Times. By 1950, the horse manure will be 12 feet up to the first second floor buildings in New York City. So so they were really praised as like this is a solution to pollution. And instead, they've been a major driver of climate change. So I don't know. I think a lot of people are ambivalent. As mentioned, my own personal sort of intellectual journey thinking about these issues has led me back to like kind of a default skepticism of proposed techno fixes. At this point, I'm really worried about geoengineering. I think it could be catastrophic, but also like climate change is catastrophic. So hard to know
we
exactly
need to think
what to do.
hard, and our initial instincts may mislead us. And although 9 possible versions of geoengineering might be bad, there might be a 10th, which when we think about it very hard, is the best outcome. But we're not going to figure that out just by casual thought. We need to study hard and, dare I say, even maybe risk some experiments.
I agree. Yeah.
Anyway, let's press on with a question from the top now by Cornelius Holtorf again, who basically asks, is it good that humanity imagines our extinction? Perhaps if we imagine our extinction, could it make our extinction more likely? Or might it paralyze us in some ways? Is it really productive to do the kinds of things that you are encouraging us to do?
Again, super, super good question. So a couple things come to mind. One is, I had mentioned earlier, maybe this is what you're referencing, that looking no longer retrospecting, but anticipating, looking to the future. If it's the case that the secularization trend reverses, then it may be the case that more and more people come to believe that human extinction is an incoherent concept, because and therefore that the human extinction is just logically impossible, and that this would be bad because defending against human extinction, i.e. ensuring our survival, requires probably at minimum at least a recognition that it could actually happen. I mean, maybe by chance we would implement a policy that would reduce the threat of human extinction, but probably we would be implementing these policies when we take seriously the threat of human extinction. I hope that makes sense. So, but also on the flip side, it could be that thinking about taking seriously this a future in which the human population dwindles to zero, perhaps under really horrendous circumstances, that this could result in a kind of paralysis on the one hand. On the other hand, the very possibility of human extinction might encourage individuals who have like very extreme environmentalist ideologies, who think, you know, humanity would, that the Gaian system would be better without humanity. And so I'm reminded of this a study, and I think this was published in 2015, where the main part of the study was surveying children, I think under the age, or maybe around the age of 12 or something, in Australia, about their views of the end of the world. And they found that a shocking number, it was like, you know, 30–40% of kids believe that the world might end before they get old. So really significant percentage. And then what I found really interesting was the theoretical framework in which they discussed the results. And they said, you know, in our experience, there are sort of three main responses that people tend to have when confronted with end of the world ideas. One is fundamentalism, which I had hinted at before. You interpret the end of the world scenario through the interpretive eschatological prism of religion. And that's how you see it. And so maybe that would even lead one to look at a scenario of human extinction or, you know, global catastrophe with a degree of excitement, you know, because on the other side of the apocalypse is utopia. And so that was one possible response. The other was nihilism, you know, a sense of defeatism, like, you know, we're kind of screwed, and, you know, there's so many formidable problems facing humanity that there's just no way we're going to be able to slalom through this obstacle course of existential hazards. And then the third one was activism. And so they really emphasize, like, it's just important to figure out ways to talk about, you know, if it's the case, here's a good way to put it, if it's the case that talking about human extinction leads to activism, then we should talk about human extinction. If it's going to lead to nihilism or fundamentalism, then perhaps you're right that it would be counterproductive to foreground this possibility in our thinking. So
there is the risk of the boy who cried wolf scenario that people often say to me, oh, they've heard that there's going to be climate disaster. It hasn't happened yet. Paul Ehrlich was predicting in the 1970s that we'd have terrible famine by 1975. And although I think Paul Ehrlich makes some good points in his book, they tend to be ignored because of possible incautious language. So at the very least, we need to speak in probabilities, and we've got to educate the world, not just about exponentials. We need to educate the world about probabilities and statistics, and that's hard because we weren't evolutionarily equipped to have very good skills in that. But unless we do it, the risk is that we will have a roller coaster. We'll get scared, and then we'll lose our interest in the subject, and then we won't be able to react in time.
Yeah, I completely agree. It is very unfortunate there's been this the record of obviously, you know, the history of failed apocalyptic predictions within the domain of religion is extensive. You know, going back, I mean, you know, famously Albert Schweitzer suggested that, you know, Jesus was a failed apocalyptic prophet who thought the world would end in his own time. Suggestions that Muhammad thought the world would end shortly after he died, and so on. But really, yes, scientists need to be really cautious and circumspect and thoughtful about making these predictions. It's unfortunate that the Paul Ehrlich prediction, because I agree, David, with what you were saying, that there is a lot in that book that is really important, and a lot of stuff that he gets right, I believe. But you know, that's been used as it's been exploited rhetorically to undermine the extent to which people should take seriously warnings of grave consequences from, you know, scientists today.
We started a little bit late, so I'm going to squeeze in one more question, and then what I'll do with the others, there are many other good questions. I will send you a copy Phil. And if some of them spark new ideas, then by all means explore them then. But the final question, which is on the top, is by an anonymous attendee who asks you, are you in favor of human colonization of the moon or Mars in order to decrease the chances of human extinction? And I guess if you're not particularly keen on that, what else would you be arguing for instead to decrease the chances of human extinction by any of the mechanisms you've referred to?
Yeah, great question. I feel like there are multiple ways, multiple issues that need to be addressed in answering the question. So one is like, there are some people who seem to believe that the extinction of humanity itself is what ultimately needs to be avoided. So therefore, we should keep population that sufficient genetic diversity, living at all times, underground bunkers or aquatic bunkers or whatever. And that way, if everybody, the 8 billion people on the surface of Earth die, then Homo sapiens will be able to persist. And it's not clear to me why exactly that is. There are suggestions that what should matter to us is more than the perpetuation of the biological evolutionary lineage itself. That what matters is like the continuation of our culture and stuff like that. Anyways, I'm sorry, I'm not articulating it particularly well, but there's more to say about that. So to get at the other issue, in terms of like colonization of Mars and the moon, there was a book published last year by Daniel Dewdney, who's a professor of international relations theory at Johns Hopkins University. And the 10th chapter, as I recall, provides a really quite cogent argument for why colonizing Mars, when you take seriously geopolitical theory, when you take seriously the probable reality of that situation, then it seems like there's a very high probability that it will actually just lead to interplanetary conflict that could be really devastating for Earth. So this is actually one of the ideas that I have really, one of the issues that I've really changed my view on in a 180-degree sense over the past several years, where I really thought that I really agreed with Stephen Hawking and so many other luminaries. Lord Martin Rees is another one, that if we only colonize space, just spread throughout the cosmopolitical realm, then actually we will increase the probability that we'll survive long term. And actually, there seems to be really good arguments that this could make us more vulnerable to conflict, and that given certain aspects of the fact that Mars has a very shallow gravity well, that it's very close to the asteroid belt, that the asteroids can be pretty easily redirected towards planets as planetoid bombs that would have much more catastrophic consequences than nuclear weapons and so on. That actually there's reason to worry about the colonization of Mars. So I don't see it. Eventually, at some point, if we want to survive, in 800 million years, the growing luminosity of the sun as it becomes a red giant, that will make Earth increasingly inhospitable, and we will have to leave. And I'm for that, but there is a lot of time before that occurs. A lot of time for us to put the brakes on colonizing space and focus on improving the predicament here on Earth. So I'm a bit sympathetic with the sort of hackneyed environmentalists saying that there's no planet B, or at least not right now.
We should wind up. I think what I'm hearing to quite a few of the questions, the answer is it's complicated. And I think that's right. And there are things here which don't easily have answers based on simple extrapolations of our previous thinking. The situations we're going to end up in are unlike any which evolution prepared us for. So it's going to take some time to measure the different risks and to explore the strengths and weaknesses of possible solutions. And often the things that initially excite us may turn out to be actually not worth pursuing when we think about it harder, and vice versa. Some of the things that initially we feel worried about may turn out to be the best route forwards. So I'll give you in a minute a chance for some final comments, Phil. I'm going to draw attention to a virtual pub opportunity that Brian from Canada has created. It's a Google Meet. I've put the invite into the chat. Many of us will be busy, but if you have a few more minutes to continue this discussion in a format in which everybody is on screen, then by all means to the audience, click on that. I'd like to draw attention to what's happening in London Futurists in 1 week's time. There is going to be 4 panelists, each of whom have written a chapter in a forthcoming book, which you can see there, called The Future Starts Now. Expert insights into the future of business, technology, and society. And 2 of the 4, that is Theo Priestley and Bronwyn Williams, aren't just chapter writers, they are the co-editors of this volume. And their purpose in that book is to promote much what we just said, that actually some of the answers about the future, whether it's existential threats or simply adapting to the possibilities that technology makes available, it's complicated. And we're going to require multiple insights from multiple disciplines and a lot of discussion to figure it out. And we better do that together rather than individually. So that's a booking now. There will be more London Futurist events shortly too. Keep an eye on the usual places. Phil, you've given us a great deal to think about. Thanks so much for giving up some of your Saturday afternoon. Is there anything finally you'd like audience members to have in their minds as they depart for the rest of the weekend?
Mainly that I think it's important to have a historical perspective on how we got to where we are today, and a sense that this traumatic story of the realization of our mortality as a species has unfolded really quite rapidly. And really the takeaway, I alluded to this earlier, is that recognizing that the probability of global scale kind of catastrophes is almost certainly unprecedented and probably orders of magnitude greater today than it has been in the past, it needs to make us activists. Because the fact is that there is not a single a disaster that cannot be avoided right now. We can avoid climate change, we can avoid global pandemics in the future, and so on and so on. It just takes sufficient effort and concerted effort among people who care about the future of humanity to solve these problems and ensure that we do properly navigate the obstacle course in front of us.
Properly navigate the obstacle course where there are lots of landmines, some of which we are aware of and some of which we probably aren't aware of. And we need to be even smarter at seeing. When you mentioned the Chicxulub crater, how do you pronounce it? Chicxulub crater.
Yep.
You mentioned it was rediscovered in 1990, but in fact, people did know about it before. It just hadn't been widely shared. So I think maybe some of the big landmines ahead probably are already known. They're just not widely known. If only we knew what we knew, then we'd be in a better situation, which is why I want to keep on doing these London Futurist meetings to spread more knowledge of what various hard-working researchers have unearthed. So thank you so much, Phil, and
thank you.
We'll draw this meeting to a close. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.